For better or for worse, some games can only really be explored once. That first occurred to me during a replay of GTA 3, and I distinctly remember sitting with the thought looking out over the game's cold, monochrome skyline, and feeling strangely sad. Never again would I accidentally stumble into some fascinating new hidden area, happen upon an unused weapon or item, or even just admire a unique view from a previously unseen angle. As much as I love the game, it feels as if I've quite literally been everywhere, seen all there is to see, and that now there's absolutely nothing left. Hypothetically speaking, if when the game first released I had somehow managed to log every single one of my movements through the game world, then plotted them as coordinates on the game's map, first of all, what exactly would that look like, but more importantly, how likely is it that there would actually be anywhere left? It's a thought that caused me to spiral headfirst into realizing how infinitely more fascinating it would be still if we included every other player's data on top of that. What would that look like, and could there be, in theory, somewhere in the game that no other person on Earth has ever been to before? Just out there somewhere, waiting. In all seriousness, with a game as huge and popular as GTA 3, the answer is almost certainly not. But if we panned out, expanded our scope to include other significantly less renowned games from obscure, forgotten franchises, does that increase the odds? And if so, by how much? With all the playtesting and quality assurance that goes into big budget AAA releases, and even just the years behind some of them at this point, could there even potentially be a game out there with entire areas that have sat completely undiscovered and unexplored for this long? Surely that couldn't be possible, right? By far my favourite aspect of early 3D open world games are their increasingly elaborate attempts to simultaneously balance the largest worlds physically possible with one still small and contained enough to build a working game around. Games like The Elder Scrolls Daggerfall, for example, boasted what is probably still the biggest continent-sized world in video game history, taking real-world days to cross in its entirety. Though, if you've ever actually played the game, you know the reality of a world that size is that there's little to no reason in actually doing so. While on the other hand, a game like Of Might and Magic 6, with its considerably smaller world, comparatively features what seems like a never-ending supply of completely unique towns and locations, each with entirely original quest lines tailored around them. All this to say, as much as it's widely accepted that the latter is infinitely better for creating immersive environments to build fun, rewarding gameplay experiences around, as strange as it might sound, I have absolutely no shame in admitting that I've always loved the former, in most cases even more so. Sure, they're always more technically impressive, if nothing else, but the tone and atmosphere of an intimidatingly massive world too grand and sparse to even comprehend, let alone functionally serve its intended purpose, is something I'll never be able to get enough of. The humbling feeling of being tiny, irrelevant, and lost in a vast, dead wasteland is unmatched, and at risk of making that sound like a bad thing, 2003's true crime Streets of LA has to be easily one of the best examples of that. Marketed almost exclusively on its 1-to-1 scale recreation of the city of Los Angeles, it sold itself on being the first game in history to have fully digitized such a large portion of an iconic real-world location. By virtue, it allowed players to explore the city like never before, and in what was easily one of the biggest physical game worlds out there. Even today, with it being larger than every GTA map combined. My thoughts on the game aside, that fact alone makes it one of the most fascinating and ambitious games of all time. A year prior, the PS2 game The Getaway claimed to have done a similar thing with a smaller section of London. In my opinion, a much simpler city, but in overlaying the maps with their real-life counterparts, London isn't even remotely comparable in the same way that True Crime's LA is. That doesn't mean that there aren't limitations, don't get me wrong. It's not really one-to-one, as the area it covers excludes a huge number of minor side streets and alleyways. The major LA landmarks you'd expect to see, like airports and piers, are largely closed off, only really being visible from behind gates and fences. And hilariously, the map is longer than it is taller, a kind of straight line that's very tactically higher than LAX on one side but lower than the Griffith Observatory on the other, allowing them to very narrowly avoid having to model anything really distinct. It's a decision that I think ultimately had the biggest impact on the scenery, because it causes everything to blend together into this droning sea of generic shapes, colours and repeating textures. Roads that seemingly loop, trapping you in backdrops that repeat themselves over and over again indefinitely. The sheer size of the map means it takes an unusually long time to travel anywhere, regardless of the distance you might have covered. But because of that, it never really feels like you've gone anywhere at all. I always find talking about this aspect of the game incredibly difficult, because at the end of the day, whether or not these are all either good or bad things depends entirely on if you personally enjoy them or not. I'll be the first to tell you that I have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to gameplay design, so I'm definitely in no position to be telling you what you can and can't enjoy, but what I can say with absolute authority is that it's definitely something I personally enjoy, and I will be forever grateful that this game exists in the way it does. The atmosphere and feelings the environment elicits are easily some of the most unique the medium of video games has to offer, and they're almost entirely a result of the corners they cut trying to accommodate for the map's size. This level of repetition and soulless, empty padding is something that no other game like it has been shameless enough to attempt before. So despite what you might hear other people criticize True Crime for, I wholeheartedly believe it deserves some serious credit for that alone. Again, I have to admit that this is generally considered to be a bad way to build a real, living, feeling world, but still, even that hinges on whether or not you're even looking for that in the first place, because when it comes to vacant dead ones, there's none like it. In that sense, I guess you could objectively critique it on how accurately that aspect reflects LA as a real-world location, but at this point I feel like I should say that I've never actually been to Los Angeles myself. I'm only really familiar with the city through its many depictions in film, TV, and games. But that's something I've always thought only exaggerated how bizarre its depiction is here. My understanding is that geographically, LA is a city in the middle of an otherwise barren desert. Dry, arid, and battered by a brutal, unyielding sun 365 days of the year. For some reason I can only really speculate on, visibly it's so much colder, darker, and almost dismal looking in comparison to anywhere I've ever seen it portrayed before. From looking at candid photos and videos taken by people living in the city, the colour palettes just aren't even remotely similar. And although I can't claim to know why, I'm not sure it's something I dislike either. It's just so anemic looking in comparison. A grey, concrete landscape that, aside from accurately depicting the layout of the city, never visibly resembles the real LA at all. I mean, they've clearly given the world this huge, menacing sun to reflect the climate, but even that sits behind this sky of monochrome clouds and a depressing, hazy fog. It doesn't feel like it reaches the streets at all, and ends up conjuring images of a polluted, dystopian cityscape. closer to a Chinese city like Beijing or Tianjin than anywhere in America. I'm not sure I can fully explain why, but I guess in large part because of that, during replays I'm always more drawn to the GameCube version than any other port. The object pop-in is really aggressive regardless of the version you're playing, but along with the charmingly tiny render distance, subtly sharper, washed out lighting, textures, and the 4:3 aspect ratio, it really only adds to this surreal, distorted vision of an alternate reality LA. It was always impressive to me that they managed to get this game running at all, so to see it visually chugging away like this is almost adorable in the strangest way, because it all seems like a visual indication of just how insanely massive this place truly is. When we talk about the scale of a video game world, we're usually calculating it based on the relative size of an object in the world compared to something vaguely similar in real life. In short, if we know, for example, the height of the main character, we can use it to map physical distance, as well as things like the size of buildings, landmarks, and even walking and driving speed. There are limitations to that, however, as certain objects like buildings and roads don't need to play by the rules inherent with real-life physical objects. They only really need to look like they do. Most of them are too small, empty, or lacking the depth to even work in a physical space anyway, so ultimately it's not really something that's possible to accurately compare, but it's the only real metric we have when discussing how big a digital space feels. Still, I feel it's worth mentioning though, because again, it's the biggest contributing factor to what I see as being the overall atmosphere of the world. These endless streets of dead, impossibly built storefronts, constant twists and turns leading to more and more roads of vacant, empty shells, all of which couldn't physically exist in the world it's trying to portray, which is something I've always loved just standing here, sitting with. Some of them are just too physically small to realistically contain anything, while others are just so oddly out of place and poorly thought through that they stick out like these bizarre landmarks, drawing attention to the thoughtless, almost random way this place was built. You'll way too often see the odd warehouse or skyscraper, for example, just sitting in the middle of suburban areas, parks, or empty spaces, while other structures like parking garages and shop windows are just so heavily copied and pasted that their perfectly identical mirror copy will just be casually sitting across the street from them. Like it isn't one of the most bizarre scenes I've ever seen. It's by necessity, don't get me wrong, but to allow for that, I've always felt like they were very deliberately designed to be as featureless and generic as possible, looking like empty foundations, bombed out or destroyed in that sense. Which just makes me wonder what they thought a city populated with so many of them was gonna look like. These are all obviously compromises that needed to be made to accommodate the map's size, but the size was clearly such a fundamental part of the game in concept that it seems like so many other components have just been thrown to the side to make way. The scale is technically impressive, sure, but how they've worked around certain limitations is sometimes painfully hard to ignore, regardless of how fascinating and charming I might think they are. Because that all having been said though, if you've ever found yourself without a car in the game, you know just how quickly the novelty of a realistically sized game world like this can wear away. The concept is amazing and I love it for all of these reasons, but due entirely to its dedication to real-world accuracy, there always comes a point where you realise that it's not exactly ideal for the type of game they were going for. A game like this. Nowhere does it hit you harder than when you're looking on the map for somewhere you need to get to, then start to travel what you think is a considerable part of that, only to check the map again and find that you've moved maybe a centimetre from your original position. It's insane. There's a channel on YouTube dedicated to timing how long it takes to traverse various game worlds from one end to the other. Their video on true crime streets of LA takes over an hour and 30 minutes uninterrupted, which is amazing. For comparison, San Andreas takes just 20 minutes to run across in its entirety, so it really can't be overstated how groundbreaking this was at the time. Sure, it's still only an hour and 30 minutes, so even though it's massive by video game standards, it's still absolutely taking some creative liberties where LA is concerned. Even I know you're not going to cross the city in that time, is what I mean. That could be because of how tightly compacted the city blocks are, or maybe how scaled up the assets are, but I've always thought that, strangely, speed in particular plays a huge role in how large an environment feels. Which is also something that's fun to think about because despite that, True Crime's protagonist is easily the fastest runner when compared to any of the others from similar games. The point I'm trying to make here is that, to this day, so much of the game world has been left unexplored largely just because of how massive a task it would be. But it's not the only reason. Again, this isn't a review of the game, but just for those who haven't played it or who aren't aware of how it's structured, contrary to how it presents itself, it's not actually an open world game at all. Really. Sure, at the end of each major chapter you're given the choice of 3 icons to drive to, and there's some mini-games, the shooting range and driving school for example. There's a gimmicky Easter egg where you can unlock and play as Snoop Dogg, but in the end there isn't anything the story wouldn't force you to do eventually anyway. There's no free roam mode, not even an unlockable one. And missions are incredibly linear, taking place immediately one after another, quite literally in a pre-plotted straight line. Despite the fact that the world is open in the sense that it isn't sectioned off anywhere, you're never really encouraged to explore it at any point. And the vast majority of it goes completely unused anyway. In fact, the lengths the game goes to stop you from exploring it always seem to suggest to me that they didn't want you to. As strange as that sounds. If for some reason you did actually want to explore, your only option is to go out of your way to find an untimed mission and then just ignore the game's constant pop-ups and prompts reminding you to pursue the objective. It gets so bad that in the end I actually just resorted to creating my own custom texture pack. It removes the invasive UI elements as well as all of the info dumps the game constantly levels at you, but it leaves you with something that I feel places more emphasis on the environment, making it a lot easier to explore at your own pace, free from the game's persistent attempts to keep you following the straight line it wants you to. Because the truth is, you can beat the game multiple times over without ever having left the same handful of streets, which again, weirdly seems to be the intended way to play it, because you're never given any real reason to go further than that. A choice I've always found especially bizarre considering how clearly it's trying to compete with the GTA series, when in that respect it couldn't be more different. But what does that really mean, and where am I going with this? The sheer size of the world making it such an intimidating task to explore, and the game's constant attempts at stopping you, are all reasons why so much of it to this day has remained massively unknown, shrouded in mystery. But oh man, are they far from the only reasons. So regardless of the reasons, and intentional or not, the act of finding all of the world's obscure little areas has this otherworldly dreamlike quality to it. Because they've sat undiscovered for this long in a game I've been playing since it released. More importantly though, just because they were never intended to be explored and highlighted like this. So for a long time now I've been desperate to put something like this together. Something to do just that. Show off and highlight all of the bizarre and odd discoveries I've made in the game over the years and that are sadly lost to its immensity and obscurity. If not just for myself to look back on, then for the possibility that it's seen by someone even remotely interested in this subject. Because despite how unpopular the game might be nowadays, I truly believe I found an extremely underappreciated aspect that makes it one of the most fascinatingly unique and surreal video games ever made. My favourite example of the game's unique visual style can be seen in one of the many supermarkets that seem to line the suburbs and commercial spaces. In particular, I've always loved how the interiors are fully modelled and textured in this low-res photo-sourced style, meaning you can only really get this close, stand here, looking in, and wonder what it must look like from the inside. I'm not sure if it's just me, but whenever I see modelled interiors like this in games, I just find it hard to convince myself that you can't get in there somehow. Because why else would they have put that much work into it? With the massively oversized shelves in all these obscured, blurred colours, the tiled ceilings with the fluorescent lighting, it seems like distance only further adds to the game's charm. It's what initially led me out of the city in the first place, because I originally wanted to try and find a good view of LA's skyline from as far outside its limits as possible. But where that ended up leading me was straight out into all of these flat, wide open plains. They seem to be everywhere in the game, a game I have to keep reminding myself is set in LA, because with that context it's conceptually hilarious and all the more bizarre. The city over there all trying its hardest to seem like one of the largest, most congested cities in the world, while surrounded by all these infinitely stretching flat voids of grass and more concrete than is on Earth. Standing here, staring out into the nothing, wondering what could possibly be out there on the other side, has always weirdly unsettled me. And not just visually, but also because I can never help but mentally place myself here. Needing to travel days and days in any direction and with all the resources that would take just to get to the other side. To get anywhere away from here. Little did I know, however, I would soon find out exactly what was out there. So to rewind slightly, that meant that I had to start by looking for an out. I began by tracing the very outside perimeter of the map all the way around in search for any gap or break in the fence that I could use to easily slip out of bounds. Again, the size of the world meant that took what felt like hours, but I was certain that with something of this scale there had to be somewhere they failed to properly close off, somewhere they hadn't double checked. To cut a long story short, that could not have been a more accurate assumption, because there just so happened to be many instances of exactly that. But specifically, in my case, I eventually came to this hilariously perfect example of exactly the kind of thing that I set out to find. Some kind of geometry mistake where the terrain was clearly changed at some point, but the barrier was just left in the air, but it did the trick and I was able to easily slip out and into the unknown beyond. This spot in particular happened to lead me out into a construction site. So despite there being many different methods to escape the map, my first experience with it involved having to pass through all this harshly unfinished scenery. Intentionally unfinished, don't get me wrong, with the skeletons of these buildings, empty foundations, and miles of flat concrete pavement, but also unfinished in the unintentional sense that it's outside of the playable map. It wasn't ever intended to be seen up close like this, and so it's lacking the detail that you've come to expect from the game's usual scenery, as indistinct and featureless as it was anyway. It all ends up really adding to this feeling that you've slipped outside of the game's reality, that you're really not supposed to be back here, in the maintenance corridors, all up in the guts of the machine. It's a strange, still atmosphere that I haven't felt before in a game like this. This might be too deep a cut, but the only thing I can think to compare it to is that one Twilight Zone episode where the couple slips out of their place in time. They somehow wake up 4 minutes into the future to find the entire world around them under construction, and in the process of being set up and built for when their place in time eventually passes through it. It's such a perfect comparison that I have to mention it, but I imagine that meant absolutely nothing to any of you. So I'll add that it also feels comparable to the atmosphere of games like Superliminal, or maybe the parts of the Stanley Parable that take place in the back corridors. Likewise, here, everything you come across being this visibly incomplete in the sense that it's not fully rendered or even modelled yet, just makes it feel as if it's not ready to be used in its intended way. And for the reasons I'm about to mention, maybe that's more accurate than it initially seems. Now, unfortunately, because of the object pop-in, I didn't get the view of the city I was looking for. But what I did end up finding would be something infinitely more fascinating. Out of genuine curiosity and a love for exploring out-of-bounds areas in games, I knew that my ultimate goal had to be to try and reach the end of the world. To cross the seemingly infinite concrete desert and to find where the land meets the inevitable plummet into blue hell. As I was approaching the horizon though, I began to see what I first thought was another section of the map rendering in. First I saw houses, then cars emerge from behind the view limit, before pedestrians, and finally all of the other decoration I'd expect to have found on any other average street anywhere else on the map. But this wasn't one. What began as me refusing to accept that I had just been going in circles this whole time eventually led me headfirst into realising that this street wasn't even part of the map at all. In fact, it wasn't even on the map, or any map for that matter. In that moment, what I had unknowingly discovered was that the game's world, as insanely huge as it is anyway, was so much bigger than I or anyone else could have ever imagined. Not only is it easily twice the size as it seemed, but it's somehow, amazingly, twice that of what the game's overly generous marketing was boasting of at the time. What I'd go on to learn is that the world the game takes place in, as shown here by the in-game map, essentially exists as a kind of island. It's surrounded on all sides by this sea of flat open space, whether that's the actual Pacific Ocean to the west, or one of the many, many plains of concrete, sand, or grass in every other direction. Provided you can somehow get around the spots that instantly teleport you back into the playable map, something I think I just so happen to narrowly avoid in my example, braving the journey across them eventually leads you to entirely new, fully modelled and working sections of the city that you were just literally never meant to see. A surreal border world sitting on the very edge of the game's reality. You could be looking one way and see a street lined with picturesque houses, streetlights, white picket fences, then turn around and see this immediate sheer drop off into a blue void, as if the game's physics are breaking along with its structure and visual detail. There are quite a few openings you can use to get around the spots that teleport you back to the map, but I'd go on to find that there's actually a glitch you can use to remove them entirely, provided you stay in your car as you drive through them. All you really need to do is quit the game during a fade out, but it requires you to be so incredibly precise that the long drive back to the spot after reloading, knowing it might not have worked, is excruciating. By far the most consistent method I found was posted to YouTube by this user, who discovered that you could reverse down this one street of all places to trigger a kind of rapid fire sequence of fade outs, meaning they're practically impossible to miss. It's kind of out of the way, but if you're willing to make the trip, with that, you're set. Free to explore the entire map as you please. The real map, and all of the fringe ghost worlds that border it. It's amazing, a new obsession of mine, and something I can't imagine I'll ever get tired of. It completely changes the atmosphere and feel of the game, which is surreal to even say, let alone experience like this, considering how well I thought I'd known the game up until now. It gives you this impression that nothing is as real as it seems, as dumb as that might sound, but it shatters the illusion that the game is trying so desperately to create and uphold. With the visible tears and seams in its structure out here, the clear lines where it slots and fits together together, you really get a feel for how it's made, and so it feels as if you're wandering around this simulation or dream world, giving you a new perspective to take with you into the regular areas of the map. Things stop making sense out here, and logic seems to recede as you get further and further out, which I feel like I need to keep stressing takes an incredible amount of time over a massive distance. Objects and structures stop resembling anything, breaking down and seemingly not playing by the same laws of physics that govern the world around them. Roads increasingly twist and warp in shape, rising and falling at almost 90-degree angles in some spots, while buildings and houses look like they're being swallowed by the ground or fusing together, as if having spawned into existence inside of each other. Second maybe to the Hollywood sign, I've always thought that the brutalist concrete halfpipe that is the LA River is one of the city's most widely recognised and iconic landmarks. It's such an important part of the LA landscape, and it's not even subject to any of the weird copyright laws that the Hollywood sign is. So I was amazed to find it almost entirely outside of the map in its inclusion here. It's reduced to this practically textureless stone trench, running the length of the eastern boundary, giving you loads and loads of room to really pick up some insane levels of speed, and find just how twisted and bizarre the physics can get out here, on the very limits of the world. Keep in mind, I'm aware of the technical reason behind what's happening here, but when you lose yourself in a game like this, you can't help but start interpreting things as if you were actually stumbling across them, from the player character's perspective. There's still people and cars out here, so you're never completely alone at least, but they create this surreal landscape as they all go about their mundane routines, miles and miles away from the playable map. There's something so odd and strange about that, and I just can't help but love the idea of it. Everyone who has ever played this game, even to completion, has done so all the while having no idea that this is going on, miles and miles away in completely inaccessible areas of the map. The game's countless ghost streets and dead severed districts are made all the more bizarre still when you realise they're all fully named and labelled, and insanely accurately too, to the point where I find myself wandering around, constantly questioning why so many of them were left out. My understanding is that in most cases, content like this is cut from games as a result of some kind of development budget, technical or time constraint. But I just can't bring myself to accept that being the case here because it's so largely complete. It works. There's vehicle repair garages, health clinics, everything that would be in the regular playable map, and it's all just as functional. I mean, it shouldn't really come as a surprise considering how modular the map is to begin with blocks and blocks having been seemingly copied and pasted repeatedly in most areas, but that just seems to me like all the more reason to fully commit to it. What I mean by that is, if the map had to look like this to accommodate the size anyway, why stop there? Why wouldn't you have it just be 10 times bigger than the already biggest map in video game history? Ultimately, though, what this means for the game is just that it ends up carrying with it all of the baggage that naturally comes with being constructed in this way, with that purpose. This strange, dreamlike city, devoid of logic, rows and rows of picturesque, idyllic houses and eerily identical streets, because it is all of those things. And I suppose, in a way, if any game was going to look like this, it kind of had to be one built entirely around a map this enormous. So I'm grateful for that, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. But this is still only the surface level aesthetic. To reduce it to simply being a product of its concept is to ignore the game's unique take on the setting and the execution of the various components of the world, which is a significant part of the vibe as a whole. So I absolutely think that the designers are owed some of the credit, although I'm still not fully convinced all of it was intentional. Ultimately, though, I think it'll always just be a mystery. I don't think we'll ever actually really know for certain what the thinking behind any of it was. But if nothing else, it being this big unknown is just another thing I choose to love about it. The city being such a big unknown means it's this strange but fascinating puzzle laid out for you to explore and discover, in most cases for the first time ever, and so it elicits all of the ominous and sometimes intimidating feelings that come with that. I know I'm prone to repeating myself at the best of times, but I really think it's important to keep coming back to my original point here, if only to really drill in just how truly unique and brilliant an opportunity this is, and partially because I still struggle to believe it myself. So to wrap this up, there's the fact that the game didn't perform commercially as well as similar entries from the same genre, receiving mid-as-hell reviews all around, meaning if it was played it was almost certainly to no real extent. The fact that it just straight up doesn't really allow you to fully explore its world during casual gameplay, and even if you can find a way around that, the map being so unnecessarily huge makes exploring it an impossible task even if you could. And then finally, there's perhaps the biggest factor of all, being that only half of it is available to you in the first place anyway, requiring you to find a way to glitch yourself out of bounds to see it in its entirety. I mean, you could even say that further still is the fact that there's so little interest in this as a subject to begin with that even fewer people are going to have seen this video. So perhaps the larger point here I definitely want to try and stress is that these are all factors exclusive to the game that seem to have perfectly preserved it in this almost immaculate state, encased in so many minor inconveniences that it's probably the only example we have of its kind. So, in returning to my opening question, the answer is an almost definite yes. It's not only absolutely possible, but extremely likely that in true crime streets of LA specifically, you can actually be the first person to travel to and see many different areas that I'm almost certain no one else has ever been to before. Spots nobody has ever stood in, views no one has ever seen, all since the environment was first constructed. So where then does that leave us? I think with the extremely rare opportunity to do just that.